5, 6, 7, 8.
Hi EXers, welcome to the EX Podcast episode number 72. This is your host, Stefan Vincent. I'm here today with you because we need to shake things up in the world of HR, talent acquisition, and company culture in order to create positive employee experiences in our organizations. Your workplace doesn't have to be a dreadful place where employees feel disengaged. This podcast brings a different lens to the HR, employee engagement, and company culture conversation. We approach these topics from a brand and customer experience perspective rather than a traditional HR perspective. Our guests, all thought leaders and disruptors in the EX space in their own way, come to this show to share best practices on the key elements that foster employee engagement and strengthen company culture, and also to spark the conversation on how to create these positive employee experiences. Not every company can do what Airbnb or Google do around their employee experience, and this is what the show is all about, sharing stories of companies of all sizes, not only to show that EX doesn't require a large budget or large team, but also that there isn't one recipe. Each company can find its own way through the EX journey. Today's guest is Dr. Kelly Monahan. She leads the Global Future of Work research at Deloitte. Today with Kelly we talk about what is the future of work and to what ends. What are the new contractual expectations between an employer and an employee? What is the shift from a cost reduction to a consumer brand mindset and how it helps create the workplace of tomorrow? Should we fear or should we embrace new technologies such as artificial intelligence or the Internet of Things to shape tomorrow's workplace? How our educational systems must evolve to prepare our children for the future of work, and what will be the skills required to succeed in the future workplace. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Kelly, and because it takes a good amount of time to produce this podcast, please make sure to review the podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, or YouTube, as it will help promote the content. If you want me to speak at your next events, get some advice on your EX initiatives, or send me feedback and suggestions for future topics or guests, you can reach me at svincent@exsummit.com or on Twitter at EX_summit. All right, let's get to it. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the EX podcast. Very excited for today's guest, Kelly Monahan. Kelly is calling from the Philadelphia area, and she is an author, a speaker, and she leads the Global Future of Work research agenda at Deloitte. Kelly, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me today.
So tell us a bit more about who you are, what is your background, and what exactly do you do at Deloitte?
Yes. So I'll start with what I do at Deloitte currently, and then maybe work my way backwards. As you mentioned, I'm our Global Future of Work research lead at Deloitte. Have been serving in this capacity for about 2 years, but I've been a researcher in general at Deloitte for the last 4. And really what we started realizing as we were meeting with clients is they wanted to understand where was the workplace headed? How could they start preparing their workforce? They understood technologies were starting to come into their work and really wanted to understand how can we best utilize this alongside talent. And so Deloitte, we take a very empirical evidence-based approach to our methodologies, and I just help lead the questions we're going after, the way that we do research, and then ultimately publish reports and speak at conferences around what we're finding. And so I'm excited to talk with you today and share some of our latest research. But previously, I was an HR business partner, so firsthand had a lot of experience with M&A work at a financial services company, and really started to see firsthand the impact layoffs had on the workforce, realizing how hard it is to create culture change. So we created some of the best, strategic HR plans, but as I quickly found out, nothing actually went to plan, and was really driven to understand why there was this disconnect between everything we were trying to do within the HR space, and yet how little return we often saw and how messy and complex it was. So that drove me to go back and complete my PhD in studies within organizational behavior, specifically focusing on human resource development within an organizational context to best understand how do we create change in the talent space and how do we best motivate a workforce, especially during messy times. So that's a bit about my background.
Okay, that's quite interesting. So when we prepped for this call, you mentioned that the main question that we need to ask ourselves when we think or we talk about the future of work is the future of work to what end? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think one thing that I'm seeing within the research is, and even just the headlines, is future of work right now seems to be a buzzword.
Yes.
Seems to be a hot topic. Everyone's talking about it. But what I'm realizing is everyone's talking about it in a way that they're excited about technology coming into the workforce and in the workplace so that we can accelerate products and services and do things faster and cheaper. So the mindset is all about efficiency and cutting cost. And that, to me, doesn't really get me out of bed in the morning, and I don't think that gets the majority of workers out of bed in the morning. We've been able to utilize technology for efficiencies and cost reduction ever since the first industrial revolution. And so at Deloitte, we're taking a different perspective, and we're really asking leaders and our clients to start aiming higher and trying to understand how can we use technology, specifically AI, machine learning, robotic process automation, not just to do things faster and cheaper, but to actually create more meaning and value for our stakeholders. And so a lot of times we see, it's a knee-jerk reaction for companies to look first at themselves and how technology benefits the way they operate. And instead we're asking them, think first of the consumer, think first of your workforce, think more broadly across your stakeholders, and how can we actually utilize technology to meet aspirational needs that we haven't been able to meet before in society? How can we actually use technology to free worker capacity so that they can accelerate their own learning and growth and ultimately add value back to the company? And so our hypothesis is if we can have organizations think to what end are they utilizing future of work and technologies in the workplace? And we're asking to push beyond just cost because we don't think that's going to be differentiated in the future. We think those companies that are actually able to utilize the technologies to create more meaning and value will actually end up having cost efficiencies as a byproduct, and will actually be able to differentiate themselves in the market as well. And so that's why we constantly ask the future of work to what end? Let's move the conversation beyond cost and actually get creative and think through how do we reimagine the way we actually work so that we can all achieve greater value and meaning.
That's a very good point, yeah. Most of the time, the contract between an employee and an organization is in a written format, defining clear parameters and rules that the employer pushes onto the new employee. So as the workplace continues to evolve into an experiential place, do you see any type of contractual agreements that would define what the experience would look like?
I think this is an excellent question. And so I really see two things happening within the future of work research. First, I think the workforce is getting louder in what they're willing to expect from their employers. And so I think what we're seeing is employees have a lot of choices now. And as you mentioned, employers no longer providing some of the longer term formal contractual things that have traditionally kept employees at the organization. So whether that was greater stability, more linear career paths, and as well as some of the longer term benefits such as a pension. And so now that those are no longer in place, in many organizations have to get creative of how do they create experiences that still meet what I would argue greater intrinsic meaning and value for the workforce. So the workforce is demanding more flexibility, more autonomy. They want the ability to engage in more meaningful work. And so I think the organization is under a lot of pressure right now in light of not being able to pull some of those longer term extrinsic levers. How do they do that in a way that's experiential and allows employees to learn, have more autonomy, have more flexible work-life balance schedules? And a lot of times I think people attribute this to millennials entering the workforce and actually demanding these things. But in some surprising data that I'm actually going to be releasing in the next week or two, what we're actually seeing is baby boomers are helping lead the charge in that, as they have been one of the first to really experience this, what I would say, social contract shift between employee and an organization. And so not necessarily having those longer term incentives. We're finding that only about 25% of the baby boomer workforce is actually in a financial position to retire. And so as they're thinking about leaving their legacy, they're also pushing for some of these experiences that leverage a deeper reason to get up every day. And then second, the labor markets are so strong right now, they're going to have to figure out ways to design, whether it's organizational culture, learning experiences, the way that they allow flexibility, so remote work, really in order to attract and retain some of the top talent that's out there today. And so again, when you don't have those extrinsic longer-term levers to pull, how can you entice talent to come into your organization and really lessen some of the control? So realizing that employees are going to come and go at Deloitte. One of our greatest recruiting strategies is actually our boomerang talent that we call, that have left for whatever reason, but then, welcome back. So how you actually allow employees to exit, I think is going to be part of an important experience as we move forward.
It's an interesting point because in many organizations, once you leave the company for whatever reason, the relationship ends there.
Right. And I think that's going to be to an organization's detriment in the future, because we're seeing, a lot more people enter into alternative workforce arrangements and maybe coming as a contract or gig worker, or for whatever reason needed to take a pause in the workforce. Having employers recognize that and be okay with that, I think is going to be a really big just mental model shift that we're going to start to see.
Speaking of experiences, we both believe that organizations must adopt more of a consumer mindset to move from a cost reduction to a customer experience / employee experience mentality to create what the workplace of tomorrow would look like. So what would be some of the first things that companies and leaders have to think about when they want to create that workplace of tomorrow?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think what you ask here is really spot on, because I think what I'm seeing, at least anyways, working with some clients, is that HR and talent function really needs to work across functional and really reach across to our marketing colleagues, because I think as marketers have really learned how to master the whole consumer experience. And I think they've done that in three specific ways that from an HR perspective, we can leverage and learn from. The first is, when you think through analytics and data, marketers have really understood how important it is to collect consumer data, and not just collect it, but actually use it in a way that's impactful and makes it easier for the consumer to do business with the brand. And so I think we have the same opportunity within the people analytics side. And today we've got access to more data than ever before. And so how are we actually leveraging that to create experiences for our employees that make sense? A lot of times I see a lot of outdated HR practices in place that, one, assume employees don't want to be there in the first place, and tend to have this competitive command and control approach to performance management, leadership development, and rewarding and recognizing talent. And so I think if we can actually get smarter and use the data to understand what employees want, we can learn a lot in that way. The second thing is, I think marketers have done a wonderful job in the most recent decade of really being able to customize and curate the experience for their customers. So, I think of an example like Netflix that doesn't necessarily take a one-size-fits-all approach to the way that they show your options for movies or TV. It's very much customized to your habits. Amazon's another example of this, who's really been able to leverage the way they track customer data and then are able to give you a customized experience when you come onto their site. I think on a talent HR perspective, we too often tend to take a one-size-fits-all approach to our workforce, not recognizing that some of these differences and customization opportunities are available that would better engage our talent. And so I think as digital platforms arise and we have more access to technology and data, NHR, I think we're going to get smarter and be able to leverage that the same way our marketing colleagues do for the customer experience. The question is going to be, how do we do that in a way that's scalable and we can take advantage of those opportunities without incurring too much cost and administrative burden? And then I think third, we know from a marketing perspective and consumer behavior perspective, especially leveraging some of the principles of behavioral economics, is that at times people are irrational and they do things much more than for just a product or a service, but they're really doing things for an experience, as we talked about before, or for an intrinsic meaning or value, or trying to achieve these aspirations. And so I think marketers have really learned how to create experiences that are so much more above and beyond than just a product or service, but actually reaching something deeper within a human. And I think from an employee perspective, we have much to learn on that space. We so often design jobs almost explicitly around extrinsic means. We still leverage a lot of the carrot and sticks to motivate our workforce. And instead, if we're able to curate experiences and realize that people are coming into our workplace every day for much more than just a paycheck or just to simply do a job, they're actually looking to make societal impact. They're looking to make a difference. They're looking to have a sense of belonging within their teams and within their organization. I think we're going to be able to curate much better experiences that leverage intrinsic means to meet a much deeper reason to work. So those are the three reasons. Use people analytics, customize, much like marketing colleagues do, and remember that people are working much more than just a paycheck, and curate experiences that achieve greater meaning and value for them.
What are some of the things that Deloitte has done around people, data, and analytics, and the customization of the experience that we're just talking about?
Yeah, so it's funny. We're still somewhat in the early stages, but step one was establishing a people analytics department within our own organization and helping build out that capability for our clients as well. And so recognizing that takes a bit of a different skill set than maybe what we've typically seen before within talent and HR organizations. And so, we've actively recruited from different spots within the organization or different areas within the talent market. So, for example, we've eagerly looked and helped consult as well for organizations that have leveraged former top marketers to come into the HR organization and help us decipher. We have this data on our employees. We are able to do qualitative research. Their employees work within our organization. So sometimes it's simply holding focus groups or going out and doing interviews and trying to get a better grasp and understanding of what it is that our employees want. And so one was just setting up a people analytics department to have that functionality and capabilities to do that. And then two, we've hired some of the leading data scientists. So coming out of either industrial and organizational psychology programs, coming out of organizational behavior programs, and really having that psychology lens as well. So we can actually use data in a way that's not just engineering based or, linear based, but actually bringing in some of that soft side and psychology into it. And so we can actually take that last mile, which we often talk about, where maybe you lose a candidate in the hiring experience or you lose one of your top performers. So how do we capture that using behavioral science and design experiences for them? And then lastly, we have, which is probably sometimes the hardest part, is then how do you change your performance management and leadership development programs in light of all the findings you heard? And so we're finding within ourselves some challenging findings that maybe we didn't assume before. So what exactly is our employees looking for? We're hearing a lot more need from our high performers to have greater work-life balance, to have, and again, we're in a consulting firm, so, that probably is going to be true across the board within our industry, since we have to travel so much and potentially work longer hours to meet our client needs. But the question is how do we create an environment and a culture that allows high performance, that allows the ability to meet our client needs, while also making sure that the employee is developing and learning and not losing their expertise. And so we're starting to transform and have been on this journey of changing our performance management systems to move away from the annual year-end process and become much quicker at delivering real-time feedback right after a project is delivered. One, just so there's less bias in that process. It's hard to remember 12 months what an employee actually did.
Right.
And two, it helps the employee. So they're able to accelerate their learning journey. And just one other thing I'll mention that we're doing is we are expanding our offerings of learning. So before, I think it's easy to focus a lot on the STEM side, which is very important: data analytics, statistics, learning SPSS or R programs. But what we're realizing, what our employees want, is also in combination of that, the leadership side, the culture side, the how do I manage, across difficult situations and employees? How do I become agile? And so we're starting to invest a lot more in that space too. So our employees can have a growth mindset and really feel confident that they can be successful in the future.
Yeah, that's what we call the soft and human skills.
Yes.
Versus the hard skills or the technical skills. Something that fascinates me around the employee experience strategy is not only it's the fact that it's a transformative journey, focusing from going from cost reduction mindset, as you alluded earlier, to more of a understanding of human behaviors, whether it's on the customer side or the employee side, but also, and what you guys have been doing at Deloitte is to break down the silos in the organization and bring people together under that sort of EX umbrella. Marketers, data scientists, technology people, HR people together to be able to design and implement that employee experience strategy. Do you see that some of your customers are doing the same thing?
Yeah, so it's interesting. We're seeing the journey begin. I think it's somewhat difficult because of the way that we've trained, especially like our MBA students and our business students. We've forced them to pick majors that are very siloed in particular. And so I was actually just down at a university a couple weeks ago and was talking about the future of work and how important exactly what you just mentioned it is in order to craft these employee or customer experiences. You need to have everyone at the table. It's no longer just a marketing function or an HR function. It's truly a business imperative to understand the way people behave at work or as consumers. And a student raised their hand and said, but then why am I being forced to, pick this very narrowly focused function that may be out of date, in the next decade? And so I think it's a difficult mindset to shift within our organizations to leverage cross-functional, cross-collaborative groups. And I think what we have to be careful of is as long as we continue to have the infrastructure, the organizational design in place that relies on hierarchy, that relies on these functions, it's difficult to actually behave in a way that leverages cross-functional expertise. And so I think the second thing that we're really focusing on right now within our future of work research is how do we redesign organizations that make the employee experience or the customer experience central and just inherent to the way that we operate and behave. And right now, the way that most current organizations are set up, it's not inherent in that infrastructure and design to actually behave in a way that leverages the experience. So I think there's a lot of work, and I still think even within our clients, there's a lot of work underway. I think we're early in that journey that we're going to continue to see around how do we design work and experiences to take advantage of what we call the adaptable organization. And I think that's going to take some years to right set, to be honest.
Oh, yeah, because many organizations are organized in ways where the decision-making tree is pretty much linear. And yes, some of the different stakeholders, either that can make some of the decisions or provide inputs, are very compartmentalized and fragmented in many organizations, and there's a lack of collaboration and communication between those different entities.
Absolutely. And it's funny, there's some research coming out recently by Adam Grant out of UPenn and saying, we have this collaboration overload and that it's actually creating burnout and stress. And I think the root reason of that is people, I believe, are social beings and actually thrive on collaboration. But if your infrastructure is set in place from an organizational design perspective and your environment is such that it's not easy to collaborate and that it creates a lot of stress, we're going to continue to struggle. And so we really think this through as an organizational design issue in order to create these experiences.
So we talked earlier about gathering people data to be able to understand human behaviors within organizations and in return to be able to customize some of the experience. Obviously, there's a lot of concerns around data privacy and security. What are some of the things from your research that companies are doing or should be doing to this alleviate the concerns around data privacy and security?
Mm-hmm. So I think this is going to continue to be a very big issue in the future. And the one thing that we're watching closely is, we have a big trend coming up in 2019 to talk about this, is how do we reestablish the boundaries of trust when it comes to data collection? And I think we've seen, unfortunately, a lot of violations of that in this past year. And so there's a couple things. One, we found out, which was really surprising to us. I did some research about a year ago now on really trying to understand trust within the digital ecosystems. When you're no longer actually seeing people, when you're just in the process of collecting data in databases, how do you actually bring that human element back into that decision-making process? And one of the findings that we found was that people simply didn't know who was responsible at the end of the day for the data. Was it an IT issue? Was it a leadership issue? Was a customer responsible for protecting their data? And so whenever we found from behavioral science, when people don't have a clear sense of role responsibility and are also just touching data within segments of the process, much like an assembly line, right? So a lot of people aren't responsible from the very beginning of when the data is entered all the way through the way in which it's being used. And so that alleviates a sense of responsibility on the person who just feels responsible for a very small portion of that, which I think can be very dangerous. And so I think the question is how do you, again, going back to organizational design, in a digital age, how do you design roles and responsibilities so that people feel fully accountable for the person on the other end of which they have their data? And it gets back to our very first question, which is the future of work to what end? If we're simply collecting data so we can either manipulate the employee or manipulate the consumer, or so that we can do things in a way that operates faster and cheaper without thinking through the implicit associations and the implicit value that also brings, I think we're going to be in trouble. And so I think we're going to see a rise of, a lot of times we talk about ethics within robotics. I think there's a huge need within the educational system to be training our STEM students to think from a philosophical perspective, to bring moral reasoning back into some of these decisions, or else it's in the long run going to actually end up hindering our ability to use data and AI effectively in our workplace.
Should we be afraid, or should we welcome new technologies such as artificial intelligence and the Internet of Things to shape tomorrow's workplace?
It's funny, I asked this question in one of my surveys when I do presentations, and I ran a very rigorous scientific study recently on Instagram by using the Instagram polling feature to figure out just the general sentiment of whether or not people are fearful of technology. And I've been surprised. In general, I usually get about 60 to 70% of people that I survey that says they're fearful of the new technology, such as AI, machine learning, IoT. And I think there's a couple things going on there. One, I find people are fearful when they don't understand it. So when you don't really understand the technology itself, and here's going to be a problem, is some of the technologies that are being created and utilized are so complicated that it's really difficult to fully grasp. For example, blockchain. How does that work? What does that mean? And then ultimately, how does it impact what I do every day? Become really difficult and almost master level questions to really understand. And so, again, it's going to go back to this trust factor. Do we trust the way that our organizations are utilizing and designing AI systems and machine learning? Do we trust that they're being leveraged in a way that's going to be to our benefit? And so I think I am very optimistic as it relates to technology if we're designing the future of work going back to what end in a way that creates more meaning and value for society. If that's our marker and that's our barometer, I think we're going to be okay. If we're going to simply use these new technologies to operate faster and cheaper and to create more products, that to me is where I become less optimistic and a bit more pessimistic around the way that technologies will eventually, disrupt the workforce. And so I think we're at a tremendous crossroad right now in the conversation within the future of work. I think we can leverage this. Technology is, by and large, neutral. It's not positive, it's not negative. It's just in the way that it's implemented. So if we could shift the conversation to really move beyond efficiency and into meaning and value, I'm very optimistic in what technology can unleash for the workforce.
Now, I have a hard time with the rigidity of our education system and how schools prepare children to the future of work and the life in general. And that's funny because a few weeks ago, I was talking to marketing graduate students, and I was asking him what kind of classes he was taking at school. And basically, he's taking the same classes that I took 20 years ago in class. So even marketing hasn't evolved really from a college education perspective versus what it is truly now in the workplace compared to what it was 20 years ago. Now, based on your research, do you believe our education system prepares our kids to the future of work? And depending on your answer, what are some of the things that need to change?
Yeah, I think, again, I just mentioned, I think we're at a crossroads with our conversation, regarding AI in the workplace and how we utilize it. I think we're at an even bigger crossroad in some ways within our educational system. And so, I recently, as you mentioned in the opening, wrote a book around how we need a new paradigm of management, because our old theories just no longer hold true. And I think from an educational perspective, there's a lot of work we need to do. And again, it's going to be a tremendous challenge as these systems have been set up in place for a time and place that made sense. So it made sense to have some of these functional disciplines. It made sense to double down on some of our theories that we had at the time during the Industrial Revolution, because that is the way that the world worked. Fortunately or unfortunately, the world is changing in a way that we're no longer able to keep up, even as individuals, let alone as these, educational institutions and bureaucratic institutions. And so the question becomes what can education institutions start doing to shift their mindset and better prepare students for the workforce of the future? And I think the very first thing is we've got to move away from a model and that we, think the right answer, that there is a right answer, and that our education is all about memorization and taking tests and responding to predetermined set of assumptions without necessarily challenging. And so I think one of the best things that I've seen done at a university with an MBA program is they're no longer handing out case studies to, as if there's a problem that's very digestible and that here's all of the information you have. How would you handle this, right, as a company? And instead, they're overloading students with so much information, so much data, that they could never really go through and solve the problem, And so these students are being forced to handle ambiguity, to handle complexity, and be okay with that and really become deeper problem solvers. And so I think we need to figure out a way from an educational perspective, how do we teach students all the way from elementary school to be okay with ambiguity? To, again, and Carol Dweck out of Stanford has done a lot of work around growth mindsets. How do we tolerate failure to recognize that it's part of the learning journey and part of the creative process? How do we move away from memorization and into actual critical problem solving? How do we make sure that students are prepared that they're not going to know all the answers, and that's okay? And part of their job as a student and one day as an employee is to problem solve, to ask new questions, to create hypotheses. And then, so that's from like a critical thinking perspective. But what I see, what I'm most concerned about from an educational perspective in working with, interns, is how do we create educational systems that leverage collaboration and interpersonal communication? How do we go back to a society in which we can have civil discourse and kindness, even when we don't necessarily agree on maybe a political stance or a business, stance? And so I think education has a really strong responsibility and duty to society to bring about students that are able to engage in that level of critical thinking, but also kind civil discourse. And I'm just not sure we're quite there yet in a lot of our campuses. So I think there's a lot of work to do in that space. And at Deloitte, we are trying very hard to reach back into the educational system and really help build that bridge between industry and educational institutions, so education systems know what it is that we're looking for and what we're seeing from a talent perspective in the future. And I think it's going to take industry and education to collaborate and align to solve some of these problems.
I love this because Sweden, for instance, has moved from elementary school to middle school, high school, and then college education as well. They moved from traditional schedules to project work, where instead of having an hour of mathematics and then an hour of social studies and then an hour of English and an hour of whatever else, they basically design their work based on a specific project that they want to accomplish within the week. And this project is going to get kids collaborate and work together, not individually, and use their best skills, whether some are good at math, others are good at writing, and some have better leadership skills or project management skills. So anyhow, they bring all those kids together to actually work on a specific project throughout the week and to go over everything that they would cover from a regular schedule, but something that is more tangible and applicable, I would say, which is quite interesting.
That's, I think there's so much we can be learning from the Scandinavian or European models.
Yes.
That I think a lot of times, for right or wrong, Americans have been a bit egocentric in the way that we've approached our systems. And I think there's so much to learn, even from developing countries now, of ways that they're teaching and working that we can all leverage. So I think that's a great example you bring up.
We talked a lot about how organizations need to adapt and what they need to change in order to shape what would be the future of work. Now, let's focus about us as individuals. And in your opinion, what should we do to prepare for the future of work? What are some of the either, again, hard technical skills or the soft skills that we need to learn or develop in order to adapt to what the future of work will be in?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's funny, it's something that, even as we consult with organizations, that is the one thing that we often hear from the workforce and leaders. But what, kind of that individual level, what can I do about it? The first thing that I would say is, number one, is individuals have to take a sense of responsibility as they think through upskilling and reskilling in the future of work. An alarming thing that I'm seeing emerge within the data is when we ask employees, who is responsible for the future of work and who's responsible for upskilling the workforce? The majority of participants respond and say, it's my organization that's responsible. But then we ask organizational leaders who's responsible for the workforce development, and they point back to individuals. And so I think we're at somewhat of this paradox within the data that everyone's pointing fingers and no one's actually taking a sense of responsibility as we think about moving forward. So at an individual level, I think if you're waiting for your organization or your educational institution to keep up with the future of work, you're going to be far behind. And so I think there's this need to take individual accountability as we move forward in the future. And then tangibly, what can you start to do? One of the things that we're finding, within my own research, I run a few different experiments here at Deloitte to try to understand how do we quickly accelerate learning. And the one thing is it's actually being open to change, and which is so difficult because especially the further you're on in your career, it's easy to get set in your ways. And I think there's a certain way of doing things. So really becoming comfortable with change, comfortable with differences. This is not something that's necessarily inherent to human beings. It's something that we have to challenge ourselves with and put ourselves in situations that make us uncomfortable. And so, we've got a couple managers who a lot of times have been promoted based on technical expertise, but now need to become much more coaches. We're moving beyond the technical and actually having this coaching mindset, which is surprisingly difficult for many people. And so learning really how to be a coach, how to be adaptable, how to make others around you better is a tremendous skill set that I think is going to be beneficial in the future of work. But as much as the coaching and interpersonal communication skills are important in being comfortable with change, I do think, every employee has to have some sort of technical fluency or digital fluency. We communicate now almost exclusively through electronic means. Rarely is work done in person. And so how do we make sure that we're leveraging technology as best as possible? And how do we educate ourselves? So whether it's something that we're interested in, whether it's machine learning or AI or robotic process automation or even just robotics, depending on the industry, let's say, for example, you're in manufacturing, robotics, are here and are going to continue to be here. So if you work within a factory setting, how do you pivot your skill set to include more of this understanding of how robotics works? Yeah. If you're an accountant, right, in your or in a finance function, robotic process automation is going to continue to infiltrate that career set. So how do you understand that the way that technology works, and how do you become either a developer of that technology or at least can speak that language so you can add more value to your business leader? So 3 things: take accountability, continue to create and adopt a coachable learning mindset. And then at the third, make sure that you have some sort of technical and digital fluency that makes sense for your career.
Because we talked about the gap between the educational system and what kind of training it provides to younger generations right now, and the fact that they may not be necessarily ready to come to work fully prepared. Mm-hmm. So, and the fact that those companies actually are somehow requesting, more of the soft skills and to be able to really embrace the digital and the technology advances and so forth. So, where do you see it falling in the future in terms of training and shaping and developing those individuals? Is it mostly on the educational side, the traditional education system? Or will it fall more and more on the companies, organizations to develop their people as they come in?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So what we're seeing is, one, I think is there is still this traditional mindset that you go to school, from kindergarten to high school, and then go to college for 4 to 6 years, and then work for the rest of your life, and really not think again about education, unless maybe you go back for a 2-year master's. And what we're finding, just based on the research, is the half-life of skills is tremendously being cut in half. So what you went to school for, to your point, 10, 15 years ago, likely doesn't make sense, for the next 10 to 15 years. So it's going to require continual education. And so I think there's 2 opportunities here. One, I think from an education perspective, as especially student enrollment declines, as the population decreases, universities are under a lot of pressure right now to find students and find ways to create revenue. And I think one of the best things they can do is adopt a mindset beyond the traditional student. So it's not just 18 to 22-year-olds that need a college degree. How do you actually take someone who's maybe 40 or 45 who had a degree in engineering and needs to update that skill set to include people analytics or to include, the ethics behind the way AI works? I think educational institutions have a tremendous opportunity here to really redesign their way of thinking, to think of education as a long-term initiative. We recently interviewed Thomas Friedman, and he said, it's no longer learning to work, it's working to learn. And so it's a completely different way of thinking around education. But I do think from an organizational perspective, if organizations continue to silo learning and development away from the work itself, into these departments, and don't actually bring learning very much to the forefront of work and have it inherent to the way that people work, I think they're going to struggle to retain top talent. I think what we're going to see in the future is top talent is going to be motivated to learn. Whoever is able to accelerate their learning and growth, who's ever able to keep them ahead of the market trends, they're going to go there. And so I think if organizations can figure out a way to do that, and that means busting down, learning and development and training programs away from classrooms and away from taking people off the job to learn and actually bringing it to where the work happens. I think through what we've seen in a lot of German companies and within Germany itself, they really have this apprenticeship model as well. And so they're able to have employees and junior associates learn right on the job and have a mentor and have an apprentice. And I think that's something that we can leverage here in the States as we think through how do we make sure our workforce is keeping up.
So let me ask you some personal and fun questions before we conclude our conversation today.
Sure.
So the work that you do at Deloitte is quite fascinating, but is it something that you dreamed doing when you were growing up as a kid?
No, actually, I had no idea a future of work research job actually existed when I was a kid. I had no actually intention of getting into research. I wanted to be a travel agent. So I love to travel. And I thought that would have been one of the coolest jobs, is helping people plan their vacations. But unfortunately, I do think that's going to be one of those careers that continues to go, or at least decline as technology increases. But that was what I originally wanted to do.
All right. So speaking of travel, what is your favorite vacation spot?
I was thinking about this. I think I have 2, actually, depending on, what it is I'm looking to do. I love traveling to Switzerland. and hiking the Alps. So have been to Wengen a few times in Zurich and just love the culture there and hiking. But if I'm looking for a beach vacation and snorkeling and maybe doing some scuba diving, I love going to Curacao, the island off of Venezuela.
Oh, nice. So what is the essential item that you always take with you on vacation? And this may vary depending on if you go to the mountains or to the ocean.
Yeah, you know what it actually is, though? It's headphones. I need noise canceling headphones. So when I'm on the airplane ride, you just never know today traveling, whether in airports or on planes, just, the noise level, distraction. And so being able to have headphones and turn on a podcast or listen to music, it just makes my travel experience that much better.
What is your favorite food?
My favorite food lately has been anything somewhat healthy. But if I had to pick like a favorite cuisine, it would be more Mediterranean. I love just Greek salad, Greek chicken, really trying to get into more of a Mediterranean diet. Would you recommend one book, whether it's a business book or a fictional book? What would it be? That's a good question. Probably this is going to, probably for most of your listeners, this might be somewhat obscure, but one of my favorite authors who has changed the way that I think about organizations and just the future of work in general is a gentleman by the name of Ralph Stacey. And he's written a textbook that I think has been instrumental, and it's a tough read to get through. But for people who are actively interested in thinking through the future of work and trying to maybe take a different lens, he's got some great work on complex adaptive systems around learning. But anything Ralph Stacey has been really instrumental to my growth. What could we spot you doing outside of work that would flabbergast your coworkers? That's a funny question. Probably the one thing is I love going to like an old school arcade. Getting some stress out by playing some Pac-Man or Galaga or some of the old school arcade games. So that would probably flabbergast most of my coworkers who think I research and write all day. Okay. What is the way for our listeners to follow you and to learn a bit more about your work and to follow Deloitte on social media? Yeah, so we've got, I have a Twitter handle, so at Monahan K. And Deloitte has three great Twitter handles. The first just being at Deloitte USA. We have got a Deloitte Talent Twitter handle as well. And then really the one that I love is our at Deloitte Insights Twitter handle. And if you go to DeloitteInsights.com, you can find all of our research. We've got a Future of Work collection page. I have a personal author page on there, so you can see the work that I've been doing for the last 4 years. But our Deloitte Insights platform, I find, has been just really beneficial in helping bring our research, and it's all available to the public and free. There's no sign-in or anything required. So it's been wonderful to see the way that we've allowed our research and insights to be so accessible. Fantastic. And we'll share those on the podcast notes as well. Any last word of wisdom or advice? I would just say the one thing that I think and I feel pretty strongly about is there's no shortcuts in the future of work. The questions that we're tackling today are difficult. They're going to require more research, different ways of thinking. And I think if we can move beyond taking shortcuts, to get to answers quicker and faster, I think we're going to have much better organizations in the future. So the one thing I would say, have patience with us as researchers who are trying to figure this out. We have a long road ahead of us, but I'm very optimistic that we're on our way to designing better workplace experiences for a more diverse workforce. That is a great way to end our conversation today. Thank you so much, Kelly, for being with us. Yes, thank you so much for having me. This was wonderful. I really appreciate your time today as well. Thanks for tuning in to the EX Podcast. If you want to learn more, visit our website at expodcast.com. If you want to find out more about our next conferences, go to exsummit.com. Finally, you can also find my manifesto on business to employee or B2E branding at b2ebranding.co. See you next week.